Julian, and thank you, Jasmine, as well for keeping me in the loop about how this initially thought as a conference has developed in this quite interesting and creative seminar series. I am also very happy to have the opportunity of sharing some ideas about my research on youth protest culture in Peru. From 2015 to 2020, last year, I engaged with youth cultural and political collectives in order to study political subjectivities emerging in post-conflict Peru. I was very interested in looking at the changes in the political language and the forms of political participation of young people in the past decade. And so I started conducting my research following first different protest movements and then moving into interviewing arts and politics collectives and activists and artists who participated in those protests. It is my contention that with their activism, these men, women, and non-binary individuals want to create a new culture, and the form and content of it is announced in their political and cultural activities, supporting a plural political agenda that goes beyond the expansion of services or rights. They are pushing for new forms of being together and being against, as historian and philosopher Mauricio Lazarato likes to say. Although my research was mainly in Peru, in Lima, Ayacucho, and Abancay, I also examined the intense connections that the internet allows to political movements, favoring the swift circulation of ideas, methodologies, and forms of organization and action. Between 2015 and last year, I was able to observe and interview similar collectives in Chile, in Santiago and Valdivia, in Argentina, in Buenos Aires and Cordoba, and in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. I followed them in social media as well. This allowed me to confirm that there are very similar characteristics in the social composition of the collectives, their understanding of politics, and the plural and connected nature of their agendas beyond national borders. In Peru, the majority of participants in these collectives belong to what we could call the new Peruvian middle classes, defined not so much in terms of income, but in relation to expectations to be able to make a living out of the education they have attained. They are generally children or grandchildren of migrants to Lima from provincial Peru, sometimes of indigenous background. Born in the periphery of Lima, they access state-funded universities or technical education institutes only to attain uncertain prospects for social mobility. Thomas Piketty states that deeper inequalities are harder to eradicate in societies where there is a past of racial oppression, and that in those cases, access to education helps in overcoming inequality. However, the expansion of the education system in Peru has failed this generation. Formal education for social and economic advancement came up against racial and case-type structures that have frustrated their efforts. They are the children of the emerging social groups that pushed for social transformation in the country in the 20th century, but with a social and cultural background that has yet to find recognition in mainstream society and among the established middle classes. There were also participants in these collectives from these older, more established middle classes, and together they have supported a plural political agenda animating different social movements, in some cases even contributing a defining participation in the size and performative strength of such movements. Defending democracy, dignity, and social justice, as many other global youth political movements, youth collectives in Peru have engaged with anti-corruption movements, workers' rights, indigenous people struggles, the environment, and racism. It is also important to say that feminism is a cultural component of these groups' actions. I was able to conduct fieldwork and follow research events with the collectives over 4 years. intensively, thanks to funding from the European Union through Horizon 2020 Marie Curie Action, sponsoring staff exchanges. This is how I was able to go to Latin America for 3 months each year between 2015 and 2018. And I also took one sabbatical semester gathering very rich and challenging material and involving young researchers in the process. So the people from the collective became researchers as well through workshops where collectively they reconstructed their participation in important mobilization. It was after one of those workshops when 8 participants and I went for coffee near the venue they had managed to borrow for our meeting. A big screen TV set was on with the evening news. It was June 2017. I wasn't paying attention to the news, but suddenly the faces of my collaborators began to show horror and enormous genuine pain. Then came the stream of messages to their phones with other friends commenting the tragedy that had occurred just a few hours before. The news were about 2 young men who had died locked in a container that was a makeshift clandestine workshop where these 2 young men were paid to stick fake labels to cheap fluorescent tubes. The container was in the rooftop of a building that had caught fire, and the firemen could not save the 2 young modern-day slaves, unable to leave the container that was locked from the outside by the shop owner to control the workers' shift. I bring this story because it allowed me to experience feelings that were not mine. I felt horror, indignation, a terrible sense of hopelessness, sadness. But my companions were in pain, as if this was the story of their flesh and blood. There was despair in their eyes, an urge to do something, collective mourning, a sense of deep solidarity, that feeling of people bound together as one. And I could feel and see the deep transformative effects of the movement and culture they represent. They have rebelled against a fragmented society that sets Peruvians apart by gender, race, origin, class, social status, place of residence. And by acting together and trespassing those borders, young people have participated with their time, money, and bodies in countless protests with generosity, genuine interest, and fierce expressions of indignation and rage in order to bring those barriers down. Their form of political participation that promotes horizontality, collective deliberation before any action, has allowed young Peruvians not only to defy what they want to change, but to enact it. This is what Pedro, a hip hop artist, told me about this way of acting. Local social movements struggle so hard to get their message heard in Lima because it is here where they can find solutions to their grievances, and yet they get some attention only after they have been bashed up in the streets for a while. We can't be oblivious as to what happens elsewhere. We try to keep informed so that we can support them. I asked another of my interviewees, a human rights activist and communicator, to list all the protest events he had participated in a 5-year period, to which I also added a few other events that happened at the same time that were documented in social media, YouTube videos posted by youth collectives in solidarity with different movements. A predominant activity was the organization of events supporting communities from the highlands and the Amazon regions of Peru who were confronting socio-environmental conflicts or defending indigenous rights. Other events in the list were marches or sittings to defend women and LGBT rights, labor union disputes, anti-eviction protests, students' protests, defense of public spaces against infrastructure projects, performances to denounce corruption or various attempts to alter the course of the law by followers of the Fujimori regime, and objecting Peru's participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. My interviewee, Gabriel, said that social media activism reinforces contacts and knowledge without substituting real-life interventions. They extend political activism into the everyday, beyond specific events, They facilitate solidarity. This is where the activism of photography and audiovisual collectives in social networks becomes quite important for contemporary social movements, both for information and to rouse solidarity. There are several pages in Instagram and Facebook hosting documentary photography and videos produced by several audiovisual collectives in Lima, and many of them are about struggles taking place miles away from Lima, in rural communities, resisting mining companies, defending the agricultural viability of their land and their lifestyle and livelihoods, denouncing oil spills in rivers in the rainforest, or documenting local corruption events. Before the pandemic, support among the youth collectives for these struggles went beyond producing and disseminating videos. They also accompanied their marches to be heard by the authorities and organized solidarity activities with them, such as collecting goods and money or joining them in collective work. Several collectives of mural art enact their solidarity with rural communities or poor neighborhoods in Lima, accompanying educational or organizational processes that may end up in a collaborative mural after conducting work that, even if it goes unnoticed, as one of my interviews said, are vital expressions of their commitment with the quest for emancipation, social justice, and dignity behind so many youth movements in the world. And even if what fuels their participation in protests is anger or frustration, the solidarity with plural causes brings an energy and aesthetic and emotional components that capture the attention of young people who otherwise would not have engaged in public expressions of discontent. Solidarity is an important expression of resistance to neoliberalism and the disillusion it casts upon millions of young people in the world. Solidarity generates collective action, provides mutual support, nurtures empathy, and instills illusion, hope, and desire at a crucial moment in the lives of thousands of young Peruvians. I believe that solidarity that young Peruvians have displayed in the streets in recent years express a cultural generational shift, rejecting the command to treasure time and money for self-advancement instead of offering them to others, not because they have them in abundance, but because they see it as an imperative. Thank you.